Welcome to the Monaco Streaming Film Festival's Insights to Help with the State of Streaming. Today we'll be discussing trends in the streaming market with Anjali Midha. She's the CEO and co-founder of Diesel Labs, a leading content analytics firm. I'm your host, Gavin, the senior media analyst at Variety's Variety Intelligence platform. And I'll begin by saying that I've known Anjali for a few years now, and I mean this genuinely. That I think she's one of the brightest minds in the industry, so we're in for a treat today. So,
You're
hi,
very
Anjali.
good. Thank you. And thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here to chat with you guys about all of the awesome stuff we're cooking up for the media industry.
Oh, I'm really looking forward to this because there's a lot of stuff that we're going to get into. So before we really get our teeth into the matter, can you tell us a little about Diesel Labs and yourself?
Absolutely. Happy to do that. Diesel Labs is a content analytics company, and we essentially measure every atom of content. And right now we're measuring in the United States across the entire spectrum of media and entertainment. So that includes everything from linear to our favorite SVOD content to short form video content. And we think it's actually fairly critical to have that purview over the entire landscape so that we can best understand what audiences care about, where their attention is heading, and how to essentially market to folks these days and break through, which is becoming increasingly difficult, but also just to better understand what should we be doing from a content development and production standpoint, which really is the multi-billion-dollar question that's on the table these days.
So how does Diesel Labs differ from some other services? Because I know there's a bunch out there that will say like they can show interest or engagement with topics and titles. So what makes Diesel so special?
Absolutely. So we pull our data from all of your usual social and video platforms that you would expect. But the thing that we do that's sort of our secret sauce, or the magic that we bring to it, is really in how we understand audience behaviors across all of that engagement behavior. So we're trying to see, hey, can we figure out who the Netflix engaged audience is, who the Disney Plus engaged audience is? Can we intersect those people and try to better understand their actual behaviors across the whole spectrum? It's a little bit more than maybe the big number that everybody's used to seeing. I know in our field, for a long time, we've been very interested in knowing how many people are talking about, content X or content Y. And that's been an incredibly important metric. I think we're evolving past that, though, to the point where we now need to understand, people who watched my anchor show are spending time on my competitive platforms doing X, Y, Z, and having that insight is really what Diesel Labs specializes in.
So it's really the everything is my competition viewpoint that you're sort of hearing more and more companies talk about in their earnings these days.
I think that's right. And I would go one step further. It's competition, but it's also the transactional elements of how production companies and talent agencies work with the distributors, how the distributors market their own content, how the distributors look at each other when they think about what we should be producing and greenlighting. So it's all of those interactions need to be supported with insights and data. And that's where Diesel Labs fits in.
So, what would you say is one of the most interesting or surprising things you've found from the Diesel data?
I think the thing that's most surprising to us is when you look at the landscape. Obviously, we pay a lot of attention to platforms like Disney Plus, platforms like Netflix. That seems to be the topic du jour that we always like to cover on. But it's really important to remember that there is an entire traditional television infrastructure in the United States that is still incredibly popular with audiences. We know audiences are shifting away from that. Certainly, I'm not trying to argue that point. But at the same time, that content remains incredibly popular. So when you look at things like the sports and specials that take place there, or some of the entrenched programming that's been on for, in some cases, decades, it's really important to know that that content is still very popular, and lots of folks actually, straddle, if you will, the traditional and the SVOD side of the world. So learning more about that and how we can essentially address the content needs that audiences have has become really important.
I think it's a very important point. I've been doing a bit of research in the last couple of weeks with Variety, and one of the things I've been doing is comparing broadcast season from fall 2016 to fall 2021. And obviously, there's not really the overall story is not a shocker. audiences. But the scale is still something that I don't think should be easily dismissed. And I think sometimes people get so wrapped up. It's almost like you can either be team streaming or team TV, and you can't be both. And, yes, Mondays at 8 p.m. on the top 4 networks, you don't have 24 million people watching anymore. Mm-hmm. You still have 12 million across 4 networks. Pretty good number of people. I mean, it's not the zenith. And it's right that you shouldn't really forget the space. And, not to go too far on a tangent, but I feel like when a lot of the companies these days have devised their media strategies, it's always been take everything that used to be on TV and shift it to streaming. Or it would be like a mixture, like if you have cable, you can watch this. If you have streaming, you can see this, but not let's try and play one off against the other. And I think you hit upon that.
I think you're exactly right. And I love the way you put it, team, traditional or team linear, team streaming, and everyone seems to have has to be, it's binary, but I don't think it's binary at all. And we know, for example, that platforms like Netflix are testing linear formats in countries around the world, certainly not everywhere yet, but the tests have begun. And, we can see platforms like Hulu that offer hybrid packages where you have all the on-demand stuff, but you can also sort of treat it like an old-fashioned, put on this channel per se and try to watch that way. So I think it's important for us to, when we think about what does the future of this industry look like, to recognize that it's not going to be probably all one or all the other.
Definitely. Even there's always going to be traditional TV. I mean, at least I'd say for the next 20, 30, 40 years, it might change how the pipe it comes in, but the networks aren't going away. And I think it's important to remember that. But shifting gears to something that will sound completely countersuit to what we've just been saying, it does feel like we're on the cusp of a new era in streaming in terms of what free streaming is getting up to. Right, we started to see this year, Tubi and Roku and IMDb TV were the first to really announce a real investment in originals. Not tons of originals, but I think some high quality ones and some that just it wasn't normal in free streaming. Free streaming was always like the realm of reruns. Yeah. And recently, Roku's just announced plans for 50 new scripted and unscripted shows coming out within the next year and a half. On the topic of the state of streaming, what do you make of, I guess it's a new arms race, but what do you make of this development?
You're absolutely right. And you know what they say, which is so cliche, because all of my jokes come from TV and movies, which is pretty sad, but to be expected, I guess, which is you got to follow the money, right? So when you think about where this industry is heading and you actually think about where the dollars are flowing, you have, we talk a lot about the streaming wars or the content wars, but ultimately, it's a shift of ad dollars from the traditional side into the CTV and addressable side of the world. And when you think of that, then you start to realize that, okay, that's what everyone is gunning for. So now how do you actually achieve that? You achieve that by providing the best service to folks so that they want to tune in through your service, through your peripheral device, through your TV set. If you're a manufacturer, there's now a number of different players who historically have been very removed from the content space that are now all jumping in head first. And you named a couple of, I think, the biggest ones who they've shifted from being, Roku, for example, has been traditionally a hardware company, right? A hardware and a software company. And now we're seeing them take their first foray into becoming a content company as well. And that's what's, I think, making this world not only so much more complicated, but that's what I think is opening the door, which is why we now have recognized that we need so much more information than we have today to help support all the various decisions that are getting made within all of these firms.
Yeah, there's definitely an appetite for just increasingly huge amounts of data, right, and information out there, whether it's, stuff that, you talked about it with connected TV. One of the reasons why I think prior to this new push for originals that so many people were getting into connected TV was you could control the pipeline, right? You could create a new revenue stream for ad dollars. So that's why TV has its own, every TV brand has its own branded, fast service, for instance, and so many companies creating their own streaming services. But it feels like we've just seen a shift, and now it's not just going to be enough to have your own service. With regards to the data, though, I mean, like, yes, data is very important because everyone wants to control it because, you know, you can make money off of it. Are you seeing any trends in just like demands from people for new formats of data, or just does the appetite keep increasing?
Absolutely. I mean, it's almost overwhelming for us here to keep up with all of the things we get asked for on a regular basis. So I'll give you a couple of very core use cases that have come up for us lately, which is, hey, you know, I'm a producer or a developer or a showrunner or a talent agency, and I have a particular piece of content that I'd love to essentially package up and sell to one of these distributors. How do I do that? How do you do that when there's essentially no information on a brand new piece of content and you're trying to justify a certain price tag with, you know, a distributor, whether it be on the linear side or whether it be on the SVOD side? Having to figure out now how those transactions are going to work is a big, very, I would say, revenue intensive question. And everybody wants to have the best information when you're seated at that table, whether you're the buyer or the seller. Another good example would be, should I be producing more dramas or more comedies for my audience? And if I'm a production company, should I be trying to sell dramas to platform A or platform B? Who has more openings in their schedule right now that we need to kind of populate with new content? These are very legitimate questions, which we've never had to ask before, because literally 5 years ago, the question was, okay, we have a window on broadcast network A at 8:00 on a Tuesday. It has to be a procedural and it has to be a this because it's lead-ins and lead-outs are these other things. And it was very, I would say, more formulaic. And I'm not taking it away at all from the creativity that was required to make those things successful, because that's a massive undertaking when you're kind of have guardrails around you and you still have to make something that's fantastic and that can stand the test of time. But now the way that content works is fundamentally the whole system has been recalibrated, I would say.
Just thinking about this, it struck me listening to you that there's been a real push from so many companies to control their data and to make their data proprietary and not share it. Now, I have my own theories that for some people, obviously, this is great because you could never really be measured against, you know, true barometers and your competitors. But if you go back to like what Nielsen was, she's having its own troubles at the moment, but it was kind of open source, right? Like everyone got to see the state of the market, and data wasn't this like kind of Gollum like clasp on the ring to try and keep control and not let any eyes in. Do you see any shift, or do you think we're just going to constantly go down this road of everyone having their own data, no one ever sharing it, and just this like air of mystery over the industry?
I think we're going to see kind of a hybrid model emerge. So the first thing to recognize is that each distribution platform, each, SVOD player or streaming platform, if you will, they're going to have their own way of measuring success. And that's going to be important to their own internal KPIs, how they decide what to make, how they decide what value a certain piece of content might have to them on a short-term and a long-term basis. And so that will always be, I think, behind closed doors and reasonably shielded from all of the rest of us in the industry. But I do think that what's happening right now, and you alluded to this earlier, mentioning that Nielsen's going through some rocky times right now, is that the industry is just pushing for, we need clarity on the new world and we need it fast. So there still is going to have to be some kind of currency or some understanding that, like, okay, we think, this is how many people watched X on this platform and watched Y on that platform, using precisely the same methodology so that it truly can be compared. How we get there is a little bit more of an unknown right now. And I think we have some of the greatest minds, in the industry who are working on it, whether it's the folks, at NBC Universal or the folks over at Warner, who've already indicated that they're attentively trying to solve the issue. So I feel like we're going to end up in a place where there is still going to have to be some kind of currency, something we can all look at, but that's not going to necessarily, it's not going to be an either or, that those internal metrics will always continue to exist and the platforms will use them on their own to, they may not look at the Nielsen numbers, but they might look at the Nielsen numbers when they want to see how their show A did versus show B on a competitive network.
Well, I think that's also the thing to consider is the nature of viewing has changed, right? Mm-hmm. And content is monetized is so different these days to even 5 years ago, where was it like 5 or 6 years ago when they were trying to get Live Plus 30 in and everyone was like laughing at the TV. I was like, well, that's because you want to look at it. But that is the reality of viewership, right? Like people don't even watch a show. Like you could classify yourself as a fan of a show, but fandom isn't that urgency driven thing that it used to be for TV and streaming shows. And you could say you're a fan and maybe 2 years down the line, pick the show up and just be like, okay, cool. Now I'm ready to watch the next, in my case, the next season. I haven't seen Ozark season 3. When did it come out?
No, you're absolutely right. And actually, so in our data, for example, we have a way of looking at the universe, which is we like to look at in a rolling 90-day period, which titles are bringing in the most net new engagement for a platform. So just taking Netflix, since they happen to be the biggest one and we all love to talk about them so much, you think about a platform like Netflix and you think, okay, last 90 days. So Squid Game comes up, and certainly it does in our data, but remarkably, a show like Black Mirror also pops up as something that has been producing a lot of net new engagement, meaning that title is bringing in brand new people who have never talked about Netflix before, never talked about Netflix originals before, that I think goes straight to your point, which is, obviously we know that there is a measure of success in how many people watch something as soon as it comes out. And probably the business value, the actual ROI will get calculated on those metrics. But is there value in having that content in your library on a longer term basis? Absolutely. And is there value in having library content that people love to talk about all the time and reference? Absolutely.
So is Diesel's data something potentially then that could also help with like acquisitions and figuring out what content fits within your library and where should you be looking next? Like even for a free service, right? Not necessarily, It's not just limited to the pay, but anyone could just go in and just say, look, Anjali, help me. And I'm sure it's more formal than that, but
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, you're perfectly right. And one of the things we do with our data all the time is this might be getting into the weeds a little bit, but we provide inherently a data science model to our partners because these SVOD players are so sophisticated with how they look at data. They already know, they have the best data in the world on their own content, right? I'm not going to be able to tell Disney Plus something new about their own content and the interconnectivity between the content on their own platform. But I can tell them something about how that content connects to all the other content out there. So how important is it to know that your fans of Marvel all either did or did not engage with Squid Game, right? It's important intelligence. And we know Disney is actually very good at having their plans set years in advance. They already kind of know what's coming out, but some of the other players don't. I would say the Amazons are moving chess pieces around pretty regularly. Some of these players are making faster decisions and not planning quite as far ahead. And in those cases, that kind of intelligence can prove incredibly useful, especially, think of like the MGM acquisition. Everyone was trying to figure out at the same time, what was technically, how do you quantify the value of bringing that portfolio of content into your service?
Well, you just reminded me of that classic we always used to see where a show would do well on TV and then the next season, everyone would have a knockoff version of it. And it never worked, ever. But I think with streaming, it may be a little better because there is more understanding these days of the nuances and perhaps different directions to go in. Personally, I will say this, I'll go on the record. I was excited about Yellowstone before it even launched, right? I was like, day one Yellowstone fan. But I wonder if other people now are going to see the success of it and be like, oh, maybe we should do more stuff set in Middle America on ranches or like dramas that aren't just the typical dramas. And sure that you'll get, or you'll be doing some analysis on that, but it's just interesting to know that you can get that deep. And I think it's a fascinating time to be alive in the terms of, on what we do, because the understanding of taste and how it shifts, I think you can kind of see on obviously on an ongoing basis, but it shouldn't be taken for granted because we never were able to do that before.
No, you're perfectly right. And, people often ask me, they're like, Anjali, what kinds of things can you guys predict? We have the data, and certainly we have tons of predictive models here, although I think you can appreciate that saying you can predict everything is a step too far, because nobody can really predict everything. But certainly, we saw a couple days before Squid Game launched, we saw that the anticipation for Squid Game actually had surpassed Bridgerton, which at the time was Netflix's largest show. So, those they seem small, but those signals, when you actually start to pay attention to them, can be incredibly, incredibly useful. Imagine, if we could all know, hey, this show is looking like it might be, X times larger than something else we already know about, or, hey, I want to build a show like this. Where would it fit into my overall catalog? These are the types of, essentially, I call them scenario modeling or scenario planning, where we're starting to use data to make those types of predictions.
So actually, I want to ask you a question on we'll talk about the state of streaming, but it goes back to TV as well. It's really the state of viewership, I think, when you consider it, that we've seen, like we were saying earlier, most companies, media companies who have TV assets and streaming assets are putting a lot more investment into their streaming these days. Well, TV is still, all right, what is it, like 70 something million people now have a pay TV subscription, which is down from 100-ish. Still 70 million people. I mean, it's like a lot of people who could access a show. Do you think, though, is there more of a mania these days to find a hit on streaming, or, versus trying to invest in creating a hit on TV? And do you ever think there will be, I mean, not to go back to Yellowstone, but it is the most recent example of like a new cable hit in the future?
The way I look at it is, I think of like to me, it all comes down to risk reward trade-off, right? So I think there's a very real reason why, especially on the broadcast side of the world, and I'll address your cable point in just a second, but on the broadcast side of the world, you look at what seasons we're in for things, and it's 9, 15, 35, 41. We're looking at, we've been doing these shows for decades, and it's because they work. A lot of times we don't give enough credit to that content. It's comfort food. It's the stuff you can put on in the background and you follow your favorite characters who've been with you for a very long time. Cable, I think, is super interesting because more often than not, I fear what's happening now is that very, very high quality content will come out on cable, but it kind of doesn't get the recognition it might deserve until it hits one of the streaming platforms. And then it really takes off like gangbusters. Even Yellowstone, to a certain extent, now that it's available in multiple places, including Peacock, I think it's actually getting a little bit, essentially, as the distribution widens, we see people start to recognize quality content more. So in where I come from, I think of it more or less as a show has the best chance of being a hit, if you think of it like that, if it has the widest distribution. And I know that's not entirely fair because platforms like Netflix inherently right now have very, very wide distribution, but that's sort of what it comes down to. I think of shows like You, for example, that no one had ever heard of really when it was on the cable side of the fence, and then it hopped over and now it's, become obviously incredibly popular. Lucifer is another good one that, didn't quite do it for the broadcast side, but hopped over the fence. So I think it ultimately is going to come down to that. And it'll be interesting because as these platforms grow their audiences into the tens of millions, over 50 million, over 100 million, as you get bigger and bigger, I think content has a fairer chance of breaking through. But then also we start to lose track of you go into tile fatigue, right? I think everyone's experienced that when you're sitting on your couch and you kind of don't know what to watch and you scroll and scroll and then give up and go to bed.
I did that recently and I ended up putting the NFL on for background noise. I just gave up. I was like, let me find, and then I don't know. It's too difficult.
And think that if you give up as someone who's in this industry and is so knowledgeable about all of the different choices out there, and frankly have access to all that content, you can pretty much log into any platform you want just by the nature of your passions and your job. And think about how hard it is for someone who maybe doesn't have that knowledge base.
I'll give you a pro tip. That's why more often than not, Unsolved Mysteries Fast Channel is on in my house, because you were always entertained by that. And you don't have to pick, it's just there. So it's
exactly.
It's just interesting, the paradox of choice, and the number of options just keep growing and growing and growing. I feel like, and it's interesting because we almost kind of came from this with the pandemic, but I felt like you could have a period where nothing's made, and you could still program your own entertainment for like a year or two at least. But it's more of the case of trying to find it, because when you look at how the industry's like stitched together, I guess is the term I would use these days. If you were an alien, right, you came down to Earth and you said, I am the head of media studies from Mars, and I've come to learn your ways of how you do media in the US. You'd be like, why did you set this up this way? The system it's not devised around a clear goal anymore for consumers or for any kind of process other than this is the way things are. I mean, I was trying to find a show recently online. I forget what it was. It was one that was on air, and it was a classic on demand of, we have episode 1 and then episode 5. Yeah. It's like, why is this happening in 2021? Like, it just, the system is so, people are still so wedded to those older, like fallbacks, even though they don't work anymore. And then I think they wonder sometimes of like, well, why isn't it working? And it's just inflexibility, I think, that's out there.
It's also like all these legacy assumptions that have been made over the years about how licensing is going to work, how distribution is going to work. And we haven't broken all those chains yet, to actually move into like your point is so, I couldn't agree with you more, where I've actually been discouraged from watching something when I know that, they've left the last 2 episodes out. So you're telling me I can get 80% of the way there, and then I either have to go find a way to purchase those episodes or whatever, like get creative with how to watch them. I mean, that's a discouraging factor. People will watch less content. So, I think there's still a lot to be figured out there. And fortunately or unfortunately, we have a lot more people trying to solve that problem too, right? Where now you mentioned this earlier with the Rokus, so you have device people getting in the game, you have TV set manufacturer people getting in the game, you have Amazon creating their own TV set, and Comcast and Walmart getting into the TV set game, because everyone's getting in now. What does that mean for the consumer? It means it's going to be a really confusing time for the next couple of years of like, what do I have? What do I not have? Everyone's talking about this thing here, but I can't get to it for some reason. And I mean, I think ultimately it will all get sorted out, because I have faith that we'll figure this out, but it's potentially a bumpy road to get there.
Oh, definitely. I like to think it will get better, but I already see signs of mistakes. I will call them mistakes, bad strategy decisions, where like, look at even the NFL, right? Like every time you go to a conference and you hear the broadcast networks talk, they like to say, we're free. I mean, they are, but it's a loose definition, because if you have cable, you've got to pay like $8 a month for them, but they like to put forward that they're free. Of the 3 broadcast networks that have regular NFL content, only one of them is dedicated to putting that on free streaming. The other 2 are asking you to pay a subscription fee for something you can get for free with an antenna. So it's just like, to me, this constant attitude of we must make $1 today instead of making $5 tomorrow.
And, and this goes back to my previous position. I was over at Twitter for a little while before starting Diesel Labs. And, I was part of the team that originally started talking about the rights to Thursday Night Football and how those could potentially, we were the first ones to test bringing that content into essentially a streaming format. And certainly, I think those tests have gone fairly well. I mean, we all know that, football, we're going to have some football on Amazon starting in 2022. So I couldn't agree with you more that I think where we're at is, especially on the traditional side, there's still a feeling of security, which I'm not totally sure should be there. Like if I'm on the linear side, I think it would be better if we had a little bit more apprehension about these types of things and not feeling like, oh, well, it's okay, I'm sitting on the rights until year X. Well, yeah, but year X is not that far away. And if at that point, if Apple wants to buy the rights to the NFL, which they certainly have the deeper pockets to do, it begs the question of then, where are the traditional media companies and how are they essentially shoring up their assets, to your point, to make sure that they are playing the long game?
Well, I mean, you mentioned that in an earlier point too, where you mentioned about how broadcast networks, so many shows are in like very long seasons. Mm-hmm. And the research I've been doing, which if you're looking at this in the future from January 2022 onwards, the fading ratings report on VIP is where you'll find all this. I'm doing a massive analysis of how TV is changing. And I can tell you from looking at it, any show that basically was on and was on in 2016 is still on now on broadcast. Yes, the ratings have fallen. In most cases, not the Chicago shows on NBC. They've amazingly held their audience basically to 100%, which is, I was like, that's
pretty remarkable.
Yeah. But they've fallen, right? Everything's fallen. However, the shows that got cancelled and then were replaced by something else, significantly lower audiences than what used to be on before. So I think we may well be in a position where we're seeing like, obviously, hopefully a different host in like 50 years time, because he'd be really old, but Survivor and, all of the reality shows, we'll keep seeing them. The Voice, they'll just keep going because they can be relied on to deliver 4 or 5 million people. And Grey's Anatomy can pull in 4. Whereas if we cancel that and put something new in, we're going to get 1. And it almost becomes like, I don't know if it becomes a parody or if it just becomes like just a familiar friend. But I think you already seen what, like Simpsons is in what episode or season 33, something like that?
I don't remember off the top of my head, but yeah, I mean, frankly, almost all the content that has survived, to your point, has survived almost generationally at this point. Now, the interesting thing about that, though, is that inherently, I feel like those programs, those titles are super valuable because they also perform an increasingly important role in a library of a streaming platform. Like if let's say you're one of those people you mentioned, was it Unsolved Mysteries that was on in the background of your home, just sort of like running in the background. For some people, it's Law and Order SVU. For other people, it's NCIS. Right. So if you're the platform that has that comfort content, is that plus maybe 1 or 2 cool new pieces of content in a year enough to keep you in the running? That's the big question that I don't think anyone right now has the answer to. How many subscriptions are people willing to have? What is the value proposition? And is that something that we're going to be able to easily quantify, or is that going to be different for every person? Someone who needs their SVU in the background versus somebody who doesn't. I
think the coming innovations that we'll see with like machine learning and AI and the ability to sort of have a streaming service program a couple of linear channels around what your viewing history is will lead exactly to what you're saying. And then if you're my wife and you love SVU, which is a good example, and every time you turn a TV on, it's just playing SVU, you're going to be trapped, not forever, but you might be trapped for 10, 20 minutes. You'll be served at least one set of ads before you decide to go. And that's definitely, it's a very interesting innovation I think we can look forward to, but you're right too in considering the role of legacy content, library content, not just originals. Like it sometimes gets a little swept aside.
Absolutely. And actually, content recommendations is something that we're working on here too. And I know I keep chiming in with all these crazy insights, but one of the things that's very challenging is if you're a peripheral maker or a TV set manufacturer, you can observe some of the behaviors that your end users have, but you can't observe all of them, right? Some of them are deep in the Netflix app or deep in the Disney Plus app, and you don't necessarily have the purview to be able to see that. And so our data is actually helping fill in those gaps. So how can you be smart about, is it SVU that I should have put on today? Or should I put on the Great British Bake Off? Or should I put on this? Or should I put on that? Those are some of the things, to your point, that data is being used, like just in the nascent stages. I don't want to make it sound like, this is already happening at scale and everywhere. I think everyone's testing different flavors of data to see which one could potentially be the most successful, at least in this world order with the data we have access to today.
Well, I think we have time for one more question. I'm conscious that we could talk forever, but I want to talk about, I think it gets to what you're saying with data and content too, in that streaming, I think, could be said to be the great equalizer, in particularly in the sense of content and what you watch, because with the availability of basically every single thing that's ever been created, you can watch full seasons of any show. You can get into a show from the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. It doesn't have to be on now. Old content has become more valuable in a way because it's able to attract new viewers. And equally, it feels like the old parameters that used to really restrict who could be a media company have somewhat been removed. Mm-hmm. I guess, do you agree with that? Is streaming the great equalizer for media?
I mean, I think what we're seeing right now is transformative change in the media industry. And the really cool part is that I see streaming, as sort of the advent of streaming, or sort of what we're living through now, as actually breaking down preconceived ideas or constraints in how we produce content. So you don't have to produce 20 hours or 24 hours, 42 minutes of, a procedural in a certain order anymore. You could have a show with 9 episodes. You could have a show with episodes that are different lengths, because as a storyteller, you want to tell them in different ways. It's funny because our whole conversation has been so much about data, insights, analytics, the types of information that we're going to need to get smarter. But the cool thing is that that's actually being kind of stripped away from the creative side. The creative side now has more freedom, I think, to explore different kinds of stories. It's not like you're a broadcaster who needs a show that's going to appeal to 10 million people anymore. You could be someone who's looking for a lifestyle content that fits into this niche for these, this smaller group of individuals. And so where I see streaming playing, I think the most fascinating thing about the world we're living in now is certainly people like me have a lot of enjoyment because I get to produce cool insights for all of my partners in the media space. But creatively, we are in like a revolution in terms of content and the types of things that we get to watch and experience and see. And so that to me, I think is what I see happening right now. And that's the best part, I think, of what's happening right now, is that, we'll get much higher quality content and much more of it at the same time. Now, you could argue, well, there might be too much of it, but I'm a content person. So for me, it's been really tremendous to see how much stuff is out there.
Oh, I agree. It's almost like what are the bounds at this point? It just seems to be, it's going to keep growing and growing. Well, Anjali, thank you so much. That was great. I really hope that we can do this again sometime soon.
Absolutely.
It was very insightful. And yeah, see, I think my intro, you proved it right.
Well, I also think you said something in the middle about how we could talk for hours and hours. And I think we proved that right also. And so I look forward to part 2 of our chat for sure.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks. Bye. Bye, everyone.